in this episode, we need to talk about one of the key players in the world today, which is the European Union or the European Commission. Now, at this moment, we know that when we talk about this commission, we're talking about this organization, it's not just about the effort that put into the international projects. How about this woman, which is called Ursula von der Leyen, and also known as Ursula VDL? Now, based on the latest article, that someone says that despite her great effort and also all the achievement, she's less likely to be nominated for the second term. How about that? And how should we understand the achievement and accomplishment under this woman? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you follow our show, you should be familiar with one of our distinguished speakers, which is Paul Hockenos. Again, recently he came out with this brand new article, which is entitled, "It's Ursula von der Leyen's Europe for Now." Well, Paul, welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you very much, Will. Thank you for asking me to join. It's my honor.
Well, Paul, again, the pleasure is all mine. As we mentioned before, when we look at all the international crises at this moment, all the way from the war in Ukraine and look at this political division between China and the US, of course, there's so much more we need to discuss. But why bother to discuss this woman? And again, based on this article that you wrote, why do you think that she's less likely to be nominated for the second term? How should we understand her achievement and accomplishment at this moment?
Well, let me just start actually with a little background on Ursula von der Leyen, because she's a very well-known politician in Germany. She comes from a very prestigious political family. Her father was a Christian Democrat, as she is, and it was very natural for her. She's also a doctor to go into politics. That said, she has 7 children, and so when she made her debut in Germany, she went very quickly to the top. The chancellor between 2005 and 2021 was Angela Merkel, and Merkel liked von der Leyen a lot. Needless to say, they're both women. They were both within the Christian Democratic Party. They were both on its far liberal side. They weren't your typical kind of old male patriarchal men who had ruled the Christian Democrats for decades and decades during the post-war era. But they were entirely new breath in the party, and they changed things a lot. The CDU went from being a very Christian conservative party, went way to the middle. Some people said it was even like the better social democratic party. And there was nobody who represented this more than Ursula von der Leyen and Angela Merkel. Merkel appointed von der Leyen to 3 different cabinet posts, positions which she filled relatively well. And Merkel certainly saw her as a possible successor. The problem is that the Christian Democrats, and particularly those who were more conservative probably, and those who were all probably also more male, didn't like her because she was the far left side of the party, and they felt that the party had moved too close to the center during the Merkel years. That's understandable. But her popularity or unpopularity has deeper roots, because it wasn't just the men. I mean, also women in opinion polls, she showed up very near the bottom of the list of, a dozen or 20 politicians. She would often wind up toward the bottom. And there are different analyses or guesses as to why that is. One is that some people say she's just too perfect. She's petite. She looks great. Her hair is always perfect. She's always immaculately dressed. She has 7 children. She's a doctor. She's gone from one post to the other. And some people think, including women, that it's just a little bit much. A colleague of mine who was quite fond of her and thinks actually that she'd be a great candidate for chancellor, for example, and said that even though that's the case, whenever she's in her company, she wonders if her shirt's not tucked in properly, or her nails aren't polished perfectly, or her shoes are scuffed up. So this was why she actually was never put in the position of running for chancellor. Merkel ended up picking somebody, actually the party ended up picking somebody nominated by Merkel. Last time we ran, it was a male, and he did very, very poorly. I can't imagine that von der Leyen would have done less well. But anyway, by this time, Merkel had put her in the position more or less of as president of the commission.
Paul, it's interesting that how you describe this charisma and this successful path that prepared for Ursula. But meanwhile, again, going back to the article, and again, this is something that you touch on, but I think it's better that you help us to understand a little bit more. This is what you wrote, and I quote, "Detractors within her own conservative European People's Party, which would have to nominate her, deeply resent von der Leyen's leadership." Now, when we look at her leadership, again, as this role, as the president, she really handled the crisis quite well. Again, from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine and also other international conflicts. But here's the question I still want to ask is, how should we understand her leadership style? And hypothetically, if her leadership style was so successful, how should we understand the resentment? I mean, it shouldn't be just about someone thought that she's too perfect. Isn't that the qualification that we're looking for? Someone should be perfect running to be the president. Someone is perfect that to shoulder the much greater responsibilities. It seems so conflicting when we are making those comments or hear those comments. What do you think to that?
Well, I personally don't think she's too perfect. I think she's very capable, and I've always been a big fan. In the European Union, her position, which she's had now for almost 4 years, she's been really by Brussels insiders and by the Biden administration as well, highly praised. She did indeed. She had a tough job in front of her during the COVID pandemic, and then comes to Ukraine, and now there's also some kind of a confrontation. I'll talk about this a little bit later with the United States over its Inflation Reduction Act and the climate programs. But and it's her style. It's not so charismatic. She's a workhorse. She works crazy long days. She sleeps in a little room above her office. She doesn't ever go out on the town as many of her predecessors did. In the evenings, all of the European parliamentarians and all the people who work in the EU are out having a glass of Belgian beer. But it's the source of the unhappiness right now. One of the hurdles for her to have another term is with her own party, the European Party. So the Christian Democrats or conservatives who are in Germany or France or Italy or whatever, they all join together in one party on the EU level, and that's called the European People's Party. So all the conservative parties of Europe there are come together. And at the head of it right now is a guy by the name of Manfred Weber. He's German, and as a matter of fact, he had been really quite liberal himself. That was his reputation for years. The thing is that during the last EU election, he represented the party as the front candidate. And if the European President won the most number of votes, he would have or should have been the president of the Commission. But people really don't like him that much. Macron in particular didn't think he was competent. So there was wheeling and dealing that happened, and he was replaced by Ursula von der Leyen, and he took it in quite a good way, as well as one can imagine. He's really quite a gentleman about it. Until recently, there started some griping and grumbling to be heard, and within the European People's Party, they now have another candidate, so they're not necessarily pushing this candidate in front of Ms. von der Leyen, but a much more traditionally conservative, culturally conservative candidate who, for example, opposes a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy, for example. Now, that's only one of the hurdles that she has to pass. That's being nominated by her own party. I mean, don't forget the elections itself, and the European People Party has to be the number one party in order for her to even be considered. So that's actually, I think, a hurdle even greater, because she does have the support of most of her party in Germany. It is also the case, in order for it all to happen, that the German government also has to approve of her, as do all of the governments of the European Union and the European Council. So, although most people seem to think that this would happen, that both Greens and Social Democrats and the Liberals who are in the party and in the government in Germany right now, they think that they'd stand behind von der Leyen. If they didn't, then it might be somebody from a different country, and they wouldn't want to risk that. So there are a lot of question marks about who's going to be the next European Commission president. It could be Ms. von der Leyen, but then again, it might not be. That's all we can say right now.
Of course, Paul, despite all the uncertainties, but let's bring two countries into our conversation. One you mentioned, which is the United States of America. And the other one is the competitor with US, which is China. But I want to bring those two countries separately. Let's talk about the relationship between US and China, between US and the European Union at this moment. Paul, you mentioned that sitting U.S. President Joe Biden had a good relationship with Ursula. Again, given the fact that since Joe Biden took over and he's making greater effort to restore the faith and the confidence around the world, and despite what happened with the predecessors. Now, help us to understand, when we understand this Biden-Ursula relationship, how would you describe it? So in other words, under Ursula, under Joe Biden, what are some of the major achievements? I remember last time when you and I would have conversation regarding the climate change. Based on our previous conversation, we were saying that some of the major countries should actually contribute more in order to create much better results or more effective results. Now, in terms of for the climate change or climate crisis, how would you evaluate the effort between Ursula and Biden at this moment?
Okay, first of all, it's good that we moved to this topic, because one of the main projects of the European Union over the past decade and going into the next decade is the European Green Deal. So that's all of the different measures, from agriculture to energy generation to competition, which are bundled together in a great big program called the European Green Deal. And von der Leyen, she's not a Green, but she has gotten behind this. And her vice president, Franz Timmermans, he's actually the one in charge of it. He's pushing it, but she's got behind it as well. And there are very few people, even in the Greens, who would criticize the way that Ms. von der Leyen has pushed and stood up for the European Green Deal. Now, as for the United States, I mean, until recently, there was a large discrepancy between how far the European Union had gone and the United States. That, however, has changed since our last discussion, because the United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which is actually more of a climate protection package. It basically earmarks $360 billion for subsidizing. It's really a kind of a classic industrial policy for subsidizing the renewable energy and clean tech sectors in the United States. It's a huge amount of money, and in a way, some people argue that it's actually pushed the United States ahead now of the European Union. And one of the things that it certainly has done is it's caused some conflict, because although the European Union and the European member states, although some of them subsidize their clean tech and their renewable energy sectors the countries that have the money to do that, like Germany and France. The smaller countries don't. And in general, the European Green Deal is not a great package of subsidies. It's rules and regulations. And foremost, there's carbon pricing. There's basically a price per ton of carbon emitted. And in certain sectors, like in the industrial sector and the power sector, and in aviation as well, all firms in the United States and in the European Union are now paying one way or another through that system for every ton of carbon they emit. So on the one hand, that's a signal itself. I mean, it's moving people away from the dirtiest emitting industries and technologies to cleaner ones, but it's also generating revenue for countries to help the industries themselves go in the direction of clean tech, or they could also be money that's put towards helping low-income people who are having trouble affording the energy that's going to be more expensive, etc. But so the Europeans were really kind of taken by surprise when the IRA was passed, although actually if they had been following it through Congress, they wouldn't have been, but because it wasn't such a big surprise, but it did pass all of a sudden because there had been a lot of going back and forth in the United States, and actually at a certain point they didn't think it was going to pass, and then all of a sudden they got one senator who had been holding out to get on board, and it passed. So the Europeans are suddenly like, oh boy, here's this huge package of subsidies. Are they so great that European firms will actually go to the United States to take advantage of them? Will they leave Europe? And so there's been a lot of talk about it, and von der Leyen has said that they're going to be, some European subsidies as well. So I'm not sure what kind of form they are, but that they're basically going to be now also play a greater role, I think, in the European Green Deal and Europe's energy transformation.
Paul, let's bring China into our conversation. Again, if we follow the news closely, sitting Chinese President Xi Jinping, number one, just got confirmed for his continuation of the president for the country. But meanwhile, if we pay attention closely to the speech, China is also gearing up to contribute to this greater effort for climate change. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, not too long ago, I believe it's end of the last year or either the beginning of this year, a few representatives from the European Union actually paid a visit to China. Again, several deals were in discussion, but mainly it really to reaffirm this trade agreement between China and the European allies or European partners. Paul, help us to understand what is the relationship between China and the European Union under Ursula. So in other words, how did she actually manage the country of China in order to balance the relationship between European Union and the US? What do you think of that?
I think it's a very hard question to answer, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer for you. I mean, Europe has long had a different relationship and different policies toward China than the United States. They do a huge amount of trade with China and have been a little more cautious than the United States in making sure that trade, that relationship, which is mostly an economic one, is protected. And there's no doubt that the European Union has much stronger transatlantic roots than it does all the way over to Asia. But and now with the war in Ukraine, that whole calculation becomes even more complicated. If indeed China seems to be ever friendlier with Russia or supporting, whether directly or indirectly, the Russian war on Ukraine, that's going to throw a spanner in relationships with the European Union. The European Union countries, and then 27 of them, yet they've stayed together so far. And, after a full year of war with Ukraine, with a lot of hardship, a lot of refugees, a lot of money has been spent, and the unity of the European Union is really at stake. People don't know how much longer we'll hold out another year. There are already some countries, for example, like Hungary, that have threatened to veto aid to Ukraine if one thing or another doesn't happen. So there's a lot of balancing going on right now. And I think the European Union's relationship with China, I think a lot will become clear within the next year. Right now, it's all very fragile. It's all very complicated.
I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, even though we know in reality, regardless who will be the next president for this job, now you're the expert and help us to understand for this upcoming year, whoever the person is going to continue to shoulder the responsibilities, what are some of the significant tasks or missions that for the European Union? Because we know at this moment, it's not just about the war in Ukraine. It's not just about the political division or what we call political polarization for the world. But meanwhile, everyone is paying attention to this economic agenda for the whole world. So again, going back to the question, what are some of the major concerns for the president, for the new president, for the European Union, and how do you think this person should be chosen or should be selected at this moment?
Well, I'll answer the first question first, the last question first, which I think it should be decided the way the European Union has said it's going to be decided, that each of the European political parties puts forward a front person, and if that party gets enough votes, then that person would become the president. As I mentioned, it's not what happened last time, and that was deeply undemocratic and unfair, and contradictory and hypocritical. But at the same time, I think actually the right person got the job, and I think that's also what France and Germany were most concerned about. As for the topics, well, I mean, of course, the Ukraine is going to be absolutely huge. The questions are going to be how much more funding can go towards the Ukraine, whether that can start to be more military. So foreign policy, which has always been kind of a weak point for the European Union, is going to become ever more important. And how the foreign and security policies of the European Union can come together and be more serious, and so that the European Union can punch on the diplomatic level at the same weight as it is an economic power, and it has never done that. There was always the one-liner that had been attributed to Henry Kissinger, although in the meantime I think they'd say that it wasn't he, but it doesn't really matter. He said, my problem with European foreign policy is I don't have one telephone number to call. I need one telephone number. I need one person to talk to. And in a way, von der Leyen has answered that question because she's the front person in Europe. She is more important than the council president or anybody in the European Parliament. So the one thing would be to kind of take that further and make a more coherent foreign and security policy. And then Ukraine goes right along with that. The second thing, of course, is responding to the United States and in the field of climate protection. It's seen very much as an economic issue in Europe and in the United States because you're basically, transitioning an entire economy and also the way economics are done. Putting $360 billion towards the clean tech industry, that's novel. No other president had ever done anything like that. It's an incredible feat on behalf of the Biden administration. Something like that was even Obama didn't get something like that done. I think those are the two big things. The European Union is active on so many different fronts and is active and present in the lives of every European. That there's almost no one topic or one issue that it doesn't touch upon. But I think that those are the main ones.
Paul, I want to wrap up our conversation by going back to one more question. Again, in addition to what we are saying regarding the European Union and also the effectiveness of the collective effort, people are very worried within the international community that countries such as Germany seem to be much closer, economically speaking, and also politically speaking, to be closer with China. Now, you are based in Berlin, and you're the expert who studies those matters. Can you help us briefly to explain what is your take if Germany were to be much closer with China, politically speaking or economically speaking, how do you think the outsiders are going to see this relationship? Or do you think that the current chancellor of Germany is taking right approach with China?
Relations with China are right now in flux. It's very difficult to say what's going to happen over the next 6 months or years' time. I don't think that the European Union, the European member states, or Germany has a clear-cut policy toward China that is seeking to push forward. I think everything they want good economic relations with China, of course. They want China to be part of the climate protection process, which it is. They want peaceful relations with China. They don't want another war with the Ukraine war, dividing Europe right now. So those are all the main topics. And I think the German government is run right now by social democrats. And they saw themselves, and a real important part of their identity is that during the Cold War, they launched what was called the Ostpolitik, or the Eastern policies, where they reached out, while Cold War was raging between the Soviet Union and the United States, they reached out across the border to East Germany and to the Central European states, and they did business. Meaning, with the two Germanys, there were a lot of different kinds of contacts, transfers of people, what the border looked like, what the border weaponry looked like on the side of the East. There were all kinds of topics that were discussed between the two Germanys, and there was a whole lot of progress made. And the German Social Democrats were very proud of this. They also called it trade through commerce. Peace through commerce, or change through commerce, that by engaging in trade with the East Bloc, that they kept them close, and they were able to talk to them, they were able to get business done. And the Social Democrats thought they could do this with Russia too, and they were wrong. They were very wrong. They were pursuing kind of an Ostpolitik towards Russia over the past 10 or 20 years. And they believed it was going to work. They believed that the confrontation was wrong. They believed that a way to do it was to reach out, be close to them. The closer you could be to Russia, the more trade you were doing, the better. And so, I believe it's the same with China. The same way of thinking, that being close is better than alienating your other, I should say opponent, but other countries which has interests and you have interests in. So, but now, that Ostpolitik positions of the Social Democrats has been completely discredited. So to be perfectly honest, it's hard to say what the Social Democrats have for a foreign policy, if any at all. They're rethinking it right now, and they're going to be rethinking their relationship to China as the next year unfolds. So it's something we can all watch very closely.
That's right, Paul. Again, I agree with you wholeheartedly. As we are moving forward with the year of 2023, on one hand, everything seems so unpredictable. But on the other hand, again, if there's nothing we learn from the pandemic, one thing that we should bear in mind is at this moment, we don't need division, but instead, we should always root for unification. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Paul Hockenos. Again, he's the Berlin-based journalist, and I strongly encourage everyone go online, follow Paul on social media. Of course, his latest article, which is entitled, It's Ursula von der Leyen's Europe for Now. Again, we hope that Paul can come back during our show as we continue to follow this progress regarding not just about Germany, not just about the European Union, but also the matters around the world. Again, Paul, thank you so much for doing this.